The room burst into applause as the renowned journalist Vincent Hale strode onto the stage, his reputation for brutal honesty preceding him like a shadow. Dressed in a sharp navy suit and gripping the microphone with weathered hands, he scanned the young hopefuls seated before him, dreamers clinging to notebooks, portfolios, and fragile hope. Among them, 22-year-old Elijah North sat stiffly, a sketchbook tucked against his chest like armor. Vincent chuckled. Next we have Elijah North, who thinks scribbling sad little pictures qualifies as storytelling. Laughter rippled through the audience. Elijah stood slowly, heart pounding as his work was projected onto the screen. This, Vincent sneered, is what happens when talentless ambition meets a delusional ego. Elijah blinked rapidly but didn't move. The silence that followed was sharper than the insult. In that moment, something inside him didn't break, it calcified. Backstage, Elijah paced in tight circles, his breath shallow and erratic. The fluorescent lights flickered above like mocking laughter. He could still hear the crowd's echoing laughter and Vincent's dismissive voice playing on loop in his head. This is what happens when ambition outpaces talent. The words gnawed at him. An older woman with a headset, probably a stage manager, offered him a bottle of water. Don't let him get to you. He chews everyone up, then forgets their names. Elijah didn't respond. His hands trembled. He looked down at the sketchbook. Maybe I'm just a joke, he whispered. But as his fingers turned the pages, each drawing reminded him of the pain that birthed it. No, this wasn't just scribbling. It was survival. And they hadn't seen anything yet. Outside the venue, rain began to fall in soft needles, soaking the streets in silence. Elijah stepped out into the downpour, not caring about the wet pages of his sketchbook. He walked aimlessly past neon signs and reflective puddles, the city's hum swallowed by self-loathing. Every comment from Vincent replayed in a cruel loop, each word striking like a whip. He stopped beneath a flickering street lamp, the cold biting through his soaked jacket. You'll never make it, he whispered to himself. But the wind carried a different voice. His mother's voice, soft, tired, but always gentle, once telling him, what you create out of pain, Elijah, becomes your power. He stood still. That spark of memory, it didn't fix him, but it stopped the bleeding. Back in his apartment, bare walls, a broken radiator, and a mattress on the floor, Elijah dried the sketchbook page by page. He handled it like a wounded animal, whispering apologies to each smeared figure. Then, with red-rimmed eyes, he picked up a pen. There was no audience here. No sneers. Only silence and paper. Slowly, he began to write on the margins of a drawing. Words bled out of him like confession. He didn't know it yet, but this was the seed of his first novel. Rage translated into prose. Heartbreak reshaped into allegory. His pain was becoming narrative, and with it, his armor. Vincent Hale had mocked a sketch, but he had unknowingly created an author. As dawn broke, the first light slivered through grimy blinds, painting soft gold over Elijah's face. He hadn't slept. Beside him were pages, dozens, half drawings, half words, raw and unfiltered. He stared at them in silence, realizing they weren't just salvaged, they were transformed. For the first time, Vincent Hale's voice didn't echo in his ears. Instead, Elijah heard his own. Tired, cracked, but real. It starts here, he murmured. The young artist wasn't gone. He had evolved. And the world that had mocked him would one day read his words. The shadows of shame were still there, but now, so was purpose. Years before that fateful night on stage, a teenage Elijah sat cross-legged on the peeling linoleum floor of a one-bedroom apartment, his back pressed against the cold wall. His mother, early 40s, worn but radiant, sat across from him, flipping through one of his drawings. "This one," she said, tracing her finger over a figure curled in shadow, "feels like truth." Elijah shrugged, trying to hide how much that meant. "It's just a sketch," he mumbled. She shook her head. "You see things people run from. That's not just art, baby, that's vision." Outside, sirens screamed in the distance, but inside, a different world unfolded, one where pain had meaning. She smiled, weary eyes glimmering. One day they'll read your soul on paper. It would be the last time she'd say those words. The cancer stole her not long after, but her voice would remain etched into every page Elijah ever wrote. After his mother passed, Elijah bounced between relatives who saw his sketchbook as a childish distraction. At 17, he lived with an uncle who drank too much and spoke too little. Most nights were filled with slammed doors and shouted news reports. Elijah retreated into the attic, where dusty boxes and moldy insulation became his haven. By flashlight, he filled page after page, fantasy landscapes, symbolic creatures, silent monologues written beside each drawing. There was no one to praise them. But he didn't need applause. He needed escape. One night, after a particularly vicious argument downstairs, Elijah wrote on the back of a drawing, "When the world refuses to listen, I'll build my own." It was then that art became necessity, not ambition. Survival wasn't in food or shelter. It was in the next blank page. At 18, Elijah left without saying goodbye. He took nothing but his sketchbook and a backpack with 2 shirts and a jar of peanut butter. The streets of the city greeted him coldly, metallic, indifferent, relentless. He slept in bus stations, kept to himself, and drew portraits of strangers in notebooks he couldn't afford to waste. Sometimes people paid him in coins, sometimes in insults. But each sketch refined him. He learned to see past faces and into stories. A tired janitor with sunken eyes became a king in exile. A teenage runaway transformed into a bird mid-flight. Elijah's world wasn't just cruel, it was poetic. One afternoon, while sketching outside a cafe, an older woman paused, looked over his shoulder and said, "You don't belong on the sidewalk." Elijah simply replied, "I do for now." But a flicker of hope had returned. Someone had seen him. In a community center on the edge of the city, Elijah found a sanctuary, free showers, leftover soup, and a dusty library. But more than that, he met Marcus, mid-30s, ex-teacher turned outreach volunteer. Marcus noticed Elijah sketching in the corner and offered him a book, The Art of Storytelling. "I think you're more than a visual thinker," Marcus said. "Try giving your drawings a voice." At first, Elijah resisted. Words weren't safe like lines were. They felt exposing. But night after night, he'd read the book in secret, scribbling little captions beneath his old sketches. Slowly, the images and words began to speak together. Elijah had no idea this fusion would one day shake the publishing world. All he knew was that Marcus saw him not as a lost kid, but as a storyteller in hiding. Elijah stayed at the center until the lights shut off each night, then wandered back to his sidewalk, canvas under neon signage. On one of those nights, beneath a flickering billboard, he finished a sketch titled, "The Observer," a cloaked figure with 1,000 eyes. In its margins he wrote, "I've watched from the sidelines long enough. It's time to be seen." That sentence felt like lightning. The next morning he tore out the page and mailed it, anonymously, to a small indie-lit magazine he saw advertised in the community center. He didn't expect anything. But weeks later, a letter arrived. "We'd like to feature your work." Elijah held the paper like it might shatter. For the first time in his life, someone not only saw his art, they wanted to share it. And that, he realized, could be the beginning. The magazine feature brought a flicker of attention. A few emails from editors, one vague invitation to drop by a gallery, and a small online following that called his work raw and vivid. Elijah tried to hold on to the momentum, but doors stayed shut. Publishing houses praised his emotion but rejected him. No platform, no polish, no audience. One rejection read, "Unmarketable, lacks structure. Try again later." It was always later. He'd never studied structure. He'd never had a chance. At night, Elijah sat in the community center's basement, a pile of notes beside him, and a cracked laptop open, tutorials flickering on the screen. He read obsessively, story arcs, pacing, voice. You want to play in their world, he muttered. Then you better learn their game. But with every page he read, doubt clawed deeper. Could someone self-taught ever write something the world respected? Or was he chasing a mirage? Weeks blurred together. Elijah survived off coffee, donated bagels and fragments of belief. He began rewriting a story he'd once drawn, about a boy who lived in silence until his voice cracked the sky. He shaped it into prose, pouring in everything he had. Marcus read the first 10 pages. After a pause he said, "You've got a voice now, keep going." It was the first praise Elijah had heard in months. Fueled by that ember, he spent every night building the novel, reworking, deleting, starting again. But the pressure mounted. His money was gone. The center was cutting evening hours. He faced losing even that last refuge. Still, he wrote. One night, as he packed his bag, Marcus offered him a folded note. "Crash on my couch," it read. Elijah stared at him. "You sure?" Marcus just nodded. "You're building something. I won't let the streets tear it down." Living on Marcus's couch was both a blessing and a humiliation. The tiny apartment smelled of reheated rice and ink. Marcus never complained, but Elijah felt the weight of every late-night keyboard, tap and page shuffle. He worked non-stop, editing, rewriting, carving meaning from chaos. But every submission brought silence. Rejections no longer hurt. They confirmed what he feared. He wasn't enough. One night, a publisher replied, "Strong idea, weak execution. Will pass." Elijah stared at the screen, eyes burning. Maybe Vincent was right, he muttered. In that moment, rage surged. He tore a printout in half, then again and again. But after the storm passed, he taped it back together. "No," he whispered. "You don't get the last word." He opened the file again and rewrote the entire first chapter by morning. The city's biggest literary networking event arrived. A night Elijah dreaded but couldn't ignore. He borrowed a blazer 2 sizes too big and stepped into a world of velvet suits, champagne, and artificial praise. Everyone talked in riddles, platforms, agents, trends. Elijah wandered the room, awkward and invisible. Then he saw him, Vincent Hale, the man who had humiliated him, standing beneath a chandelier, surrounded by flattery. Elijah froze. Memories surged. He turned to leave, but bumped into a young editor spilling wine across her sleeve. She laughed it off. "You're Elijah North, right? I read your submission months ago." He stared, shocked. "Why didn't you reply?" She shrugged. "I was too green to fight for it, but it stayed with me." That small crack, recognition, was everything. Maybe the gate wasn't locked. Maybe he just needed to learn how to knock louder. Back at Marcus Place, Elijah sat awake with a fire in his chest. Not anger, resolve. He took out every rejection, every torn page, every old sketch. Laying them across the floor, he traced the journey. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't polished. But it was real. A novel wasn't a perfect sentence. It was a soul screaming through structure. Elijah knew now. The story didn't need permission. It needed truth. With sunrise breaking through the window, he opened a fresh document. The title blinked on the screen. The Observer. It wasn't just a metaphor anymore. It was him. He wasn't standing on the outside watching others succeed. Not anymore. He was done waiting to be let in. It was time to write like he belonged. Elijah submitted the Observer under a pseudonym, Adad N. Pierce. Not out of fear, but freedom. Without his name attached, there were no assumptions, no pity, no memory of public humiliation. Just the story. He sent it to dozens of small presses and online zines. Weeks passed. Then one day, an email pinged through. "We love your manuscript. We'd like to publish it." Elijah stared at the screen, numb. His hands trembled as he whispered, "They want the story." Marcus, returning from work, saw his face. What happened? Elijah showed him the email. Marcus smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. You got in, on your own terms. For the first time in his life, Elijah wasn't chasing permission. He had earned it. Silently, steadily, fiercely. The boy they once mocked was about to become the writer the world couldn't ignore. The book released quietly, no launch party, no publicists, just a digital drop and a few posts on indie-lit blogs. But something strange happened. People read it. And they didn't just like it, they shared it. A Reddit thread titled, "Who is A.N. Pierce?" exploded. Readers quoted lines. Artists recreated scenes. One user wrote, "It feels like this book knew me before I knew myself." Sales surged. Elijah watched in disbelief as the Observer climbed online charts. He still walked past Vincent Hale's face in bookstore posters, but now, tucked inside those same stores, his book sat beside giants. Anonymous, yet undeniable. The same voice that had been silenced now echoed in thousands of homes. Elijah didn't smile in victory, he inhaled in disbelief. The world hadn't just noticed him. It had started to listen. Then came the call. A literary agency wanted to represent Pierce for a wider release. An international publisher followed. TV rights, inquiries began to trickle in. And then the email that stopped Elijah cold, Vincent Hale's assistant, reaching out for an exclusive interview with A.N. Pierce. Elijah reread the message a dozen times. He whispered, "He doesn't know." Vincent didn't recognize the name. He didn't remember the boy he'd humiliated. Elijah laughed, bitter and low. I was invisible to him then. And now, I'm his next headline. Marcus asked, "You gonna do it?" Elijah looked out the window, storm clouds curling on the horizon. "I think I have to. Not for revenge. Not for applause. But to stand across from the man who once crushed him. And realize he no longer held that power." In the days leading up to the interview, Elijah barely slept. He studied Vincent's recent shows, his usual tactics. The more he watched, the more surreal it felt. Vincent hadn't changed. The same snide smirk, the same jabs cloaked in intellect. Elijah rehearsed answers, then threw them out. He didn't want a script. He wanted truth. The morning of the taping, Elijah stared into the mirror, seeing both the boy who once trembled beneath this man's words, and the writer who now stood taller than them. "You don't get to define me," he whispered to his reflection. "Not anymore." He buttoned his shirt, shoulders squared. The studio car honked outside. It was time. Not for confrontation, but for closure. This wasn't about Vincent Hale anymore. It was about reclaiming the voice he almost lost. The studio was colder than he expected. Harsh lights, fake plants, the usual illusion of warmth. Vincent entered last, older but still commanding. He barely looked at Elijah before sitting across from him. "So, Mr. Pierce," he said with a grin, "let's find out who you really are." Cameras rolled. Elijah answered calmly, letting each word land with quiet power. He spoke of pain, silence, and survival. Vincent tried to steer, interrupt, provoke, but Elijah didn't flinch. At the end, Vincent leaned in. "You're articulate, surprisingly so. Ever considered journalism?" Elijah smiled gently. "No, I prefer truth over performance." Vincent blinked, a flicker of confusion breaking his mask. As the segment ended, Elijah rose and said, "By the way, we've met before." Vincent stared, but said nothing. That silence. It was everything. The interview aired. Within hours, the internet exploded. Clips of Elijah's poised, piercing replies spread like wildfire. Viewers called it the moment truth silenced arrogance. Blogs dissected every line. A.N. Pierce confronts Vincent Hale and wins without raising his voice. Vincent issued no comment, but the public had seen enough. Sales of The Observer soared. Within days, it topped bestseller charts. But Elijah didn't celebrate. He sat alone in his room, staring at the screen, trying to understand how silence and restraint had spoken louder than outrage ever could. Marcus entered with a quiet smile. "You're everywhere, man." Elijah shook his head. "I just told the truth." Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. "Exactly," and the world finally heard it. Elijah turned to the wall, where his mother's old scarf now hung beside his first rejection letter. This wasn't vindication. It was transformation. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of him. Talk shows, book clubs, panels, he declined most. Not out of pride, but self-preservation. Elijah wasn't built for celebrity. But when an invitation came to speak at the very festival where Vincent had humiliated him 2 years ago, he paused. This time, he wouldn't be on the sidelines. He'd be the keynote. Marcus watched him sign the agreement, eyebrows raised. "Full circle," he said. Elijah gave a slow nod. "Yeah, but this time I'm walking in as me." He didn't prepare a script. He didn't need one. His story was carved into every word he'd written, every door that had slammed in his face. The same crowd that once laughed at him would now sit in silence and listen. But Elijah wasn't there to prove them wrong. He was there to prove himself right. The festival hall looked the same, but everything felt different. This time, Elijah stood behind the mic, not before it. He looked out at a crowd of hundreds. No sketchbook clutched to his chest. Just a single sheet in his pocket, the first rejection letter he ever received. 2 years ago I stood right there, he said, pointing to a seat near the back. Someone on this stage said I wasn't a storyteller, that my ambition outpaced my talent. The room fell silent. And they were right, then. He smiled. But stories aren't born perfect. They're carved through pain, doubt, and persistence. A pause. And sometimes what makes you invisible is the very thing that makes you unforgettable. When he finished, the applause wasn't loud, it was thunderous. But the sound that meant the most was the silence before it. The sound of every heart listening. And backstage after his speech, Elijah stepped into the quiet. He leaned against the wall, breathing deeply, overwhelmed, not by pride, but release. A door creaked open. Vincent Hale walked in, alone. He looked older, smaller. "You spoke well," he said, eyes not meeting Elijah's. Elijah didn't reply. Vincent continued, voice low. "I don't remember what I said to you that day. I've said things like that to a lot of people." Elijah nodded slowly. "I know." A pause. "But I do." Vincent looked up, surprised. "I remember everything." They stood in silence. Vincent finally said, "You didn't need me, that's clear now." Elijah replied, voice steady, "No, but you made sure I had something to write about." Vincent gave a tight, bitter smile and left. Elijah watched the door close. No apology. But no power either. Later that night, Elijah walked alone through the quiet city streets. The world buzzed around him, phones pinging, cars humming, but he felt still. Not empty but full. Not victorious but peaceful. He passed a bookstore and paused. In the window, the observer sat beside a sign, featured title of the month. He smiled faintly and moved on. At home, he pulled out his sketchbook, the one from years ago, pages now worn soft. He flipped to the final blank page, and with a black pen, he began to draw. Not for publication. Not for praise. Just for himself. A boy in a cage of words, cracking it open from within. Below it he wrote, "I was never voiceless. I just hadn't learned how to speak yet." Then he closed the book and turned out the light. The months following the festival were different, not louder but clearer. Elijah no longer chased recognition, he managed it. Public readings became intimate conversations. Fan letters arrived from prisons, high schools, and hospital beds. People weren't just reading his story, they were finding their own in it. One letter written in trembling handwriting read, You saved me from disappearing. Elijah kept it on his wall. Fame no longer thrilled him. It humbled him. In a world that once made him invisible, his voice had become a bridge. One afternoon, while walking through a quiet park, a boy approached shyly, holding a worn copy of The Observer. "Are you him?" the boy asked. Elijah nodded. The boy smiled. "Then thank you for not giving up." Elijah knelt to eye level and replied, "Neither should you." The boy nodded, clutching the book like armor. Elijah began volunteering at the community center again, not as a guest, but as a mentor. He hosted a weekly writing circle for teens, most of them angry, quiet, or invisible in their own ways. He didn't lecture. He listened. One evening, a girl read a poem so raw it left the room breathless. "I don't know if it's good," she whispered. Elijah smiled. "If it's honest, it's already good." He saw himself in all of them, in the trembling hands, the scribbled margins, the pages torn from shame. But now, he stood on the other side of the mirror, offering a hand back through. Writing had once saved his life. Now it was saving others. And in giving voice to their silence, Elijah found something deeper than fame. He found purpose. A prestigious literary award arrived, one he never imagined he'd be considered for. The ceremony was televised, black tie, and intimidating. Elijah wore a simple tailored suit, hair tied back, no entourage. When his name was announced as the winner, applause thundered through the hall. He stepped up to the podium, calm and steady. "I accept this not as a writer who got lucky," he said, "but as a kid who was told he never would." He paused. "To every person who's been laughed at, silenced, or told to be realistic, write anyway." The audience rose in a standing ovation. But Elijah didn't feel taller. He just felt seen. Not for what he'd survived, but for what he had created from it. The world had listened. But more importantly, he'd spoken. In the quiet weeks that followed, Elijah returned to the one place he hadn't visited since everything changed, his mother's old apartment building. The neighborhood had aged, the paint peeled more than before. But when he reached the door of 3B, he stood for a long time. No one answered. It didn't matter. He sat on the front steps, sketchbook in hand, and drew the building exactly as he remembered it, every crack, every shadow. On the final page he wrote, "This is where I began. This is where she told me I could." Then he tucked a copy of his book into the mail slot, wrapped in brown paper, labeled simply, "For the next kid who lives here." That act wasn't for closure. It was for continuation. Late one night, Elijah opened a folder on his computer titled Book 2. It had been sitting untouched for months. He stared at the blinking cursor. Fear stirred. New fear. What if the first book was a fluke? What if he'd already said everything worth saying? But then he remembered the boy in the park, the girl at the writing circle, the silence before applause. He wasn't writing to be remembered. He was writing because it was how he stayed alive. He placed his fingers on the keys. First line appeared. The cage had opened, but the world beyond it wasn't quiet. It was waiting. Elijah smiled. It wasn't polished, but it was honest. And that was always enough. He hit save, then leaned back, ready to begin again. A year had passed since Elijah's book tour ended, and the world had begun to quiet again. One rainy evening, while scrolling through headlines, he saw it. Vincent Hale announces retirement from journalism. No interviews. No farewell column. Just silence. Out of curiosity, Elijah clicked a buried video clip, an old recording of that fateful audition day. There he was, younger, thinner, clutching his sketchbook. Vincent's voice rang through the speakers, cruel and clear. Elijah watched it all without flinching. Then, slowly, he shut the laptop. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. That version of himself was a ghost he no longer carried. He walked over to the shelf, pulled down his sketchbook, the original one, and gently placed it in a sealed box. Not to forget it, but because he no longer needed it to define him. Later that week, Elijah was invited to speak at an inner-city arts high school. The classroom was packed, students hunched over desks, eager but guarded. He walked in, not with fanfare, but with familiarity. He spoke of failure, rejection, and voice. "The world won't always hear you right away," he told them. "But that doesn't mean your voice is broken." A student raised their hand and asked, "What if we're not good enough yet?" Elijah smiled. "Then you're exactly where you need to be." Afterward he stayed, signing notebooks and talking to students one-on-one. As he left, one girl slipped him a note, folded in half. It read, "Thank you for reminding me I don't have to be perfect to be powerful." He placed it in his pocket, over his heart, and walked out into the sun. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of a bookstore, Vincent Hale sat alone. No cameras. No entourage. Just a paperback copy of The Observer in his hands. He read slowly, lips pressed tight. There was no note, no signature inside. Just a story. At one point he paused and looked up, as if recognizing a moment in the prose that belonged to him. Or perhaps to who he once was. He didn't speak. He simply turned the page. Around him no one noticed. The world had moved on. But Vincent kept reading. Not as a critic. Not as a voice of judgment. Just as a man with time and regret. And somewhere beneath all that ego and sharpness, maybe a hint of humility stirred. Not redemption, but acknowledgement. That night, Elijah sat on the fire escape of his new apartment, 3 floors up, overlooking a city that once swallowed him whole. Now, it pulsed below like a living canvas. He sipped tea and held a fresh notebook in his lap. Blank. Untouched. But not intimidating. Just waiting. Behind him, his shelves were lined with translated editions of The Observer. Yet his eyes weren't on them. They were on the future. He didn't need to be the loudest voice. He didn't need to win every stage. He only needed to keep telling the truth. Even if it trembled. Even if no one applauded. The sky above shifted from navy to black, stars flickering like punctuation marks waiting for story to begin. He opened the notebook and began to write. Final scene. A gallery wall. Simple, quiet, dignified. On it hangs a framed original sketch, The Boy in the Cage of Words. Below it, a plaque reads, "On Loan." From the private collection of A.N. Pierce. Viewers pass by slowly, stopping, staring. No fanfare. No press. Just presence. Nearby, a young girl sketches in a pocket notebook, unaware of the man watching from a distance. Elijah, hands in his coat pockets, unseen by most. He smiles softly, not because they finally saw him, but because they now saw themselves. This wasn't about revenge. Or even recognition. This was about legacy. And it was no longer his story alone. As he turned to leave, one final plaque caught the light. It read, "Sometimes the quietest voice echoes the longest."